It began with a threat I'll never forget. "Rip out every last vegetable in that yard, or you're going to lose this house." The person screaming at me was my neighbor, and it was a promise that was about to change my life. Let's start with the immediate crisis and work our way backwards through the conflict that consumed 6 months. I'm standing in my backyard, staring at a registered letter in my hands. It details $50,000 in fines for my so-called illegal garden. That's when Margaret Chen, our HOA president, appears at the fence line. She's wearing that smile, the kind that looks friendly but never reaches her eyes. She tilts her head and says, "I did warn you, didn't I?" And in that moment, my mind goes straight to a yellow document locked inside my safe-dated 1890, a document she has no idea exists. A document that's about to turn this into the worst decision of her power-hungry life. Because here's the thing about people like Margaret. They collect violations the way normal people collect stamps. And right now, standing in my garden, surrounded by tomato plants and herb boxes my grandfather planted on this exact spot 60 years ago, I'm violation number 47 this year alone. She's looking at me like I'm the criminal, even though 3 months ago she installed an Olympic-sized swimming pool that technically violates the same water usage ordinance she's citing against my drip irrigation system. What Margaret doesn't know, what she couldn't know because she moved into this neighborhood 5 years ago with her real estate money and her obsession with control, is that my family has been on this land since 1893. And that garden she's so desperate to destroy, it was never really mine. So let me back up 6 months, because that's when Margaret first knocked on my door. You need to understand something about this woman. She doesn't knock like a normal person. She knocks like she's executing a warrant. 3 sharp raps that sound like accusations. When I opened the door that Saturday morning, she was already holding her iPad at chest level like a shield, scrolling through photos of my property that she'd clearly taken from the sidewalk. "Mr. Harrison," she said. Not hello, not good morning, just my last name, delivered like a diagnosis. "I've documented 17 separate violations of the community covenant, and I'm here as a courtesy before I file the formal complaint." I'm standing there in my weekend clothes, coffee still brewing in the kitchen, looking at this woman I've maybe spoken to twice in the 4 years I've lived here, and she's swiping through photos of my house like she's presenting evidence at trial. There's my front garden with the native wildflowers. There's the vegetable patch visible from the street. There's the rain barrel I installed last spring. Each photo annotated with arrows and circles like a crime scene investigation. "I'm sorry," I said. "Violations of what, exactly?" I watched her face do this thing, this tightening around the mouth that I'd come to recognize as her tell, the look she gets when someone questions her authority. The community covenant clearly states that front yard gardens must be ornamental only, water collection systems require pre-approval, and visible vegetable cultivation is prohibited in any area viewable from public streets, she said, reciting it like scripture. And I'm thinking about how I read through that covenant before I bought this house, how I specifically checked that there were no restrictions on native plants or sustainable gardening, how my real estate agent and I laughed about how loosely it was written. "Margaret, I grew up in this house," I told her. "My grandfather built it in 1952, and there's been a garden here since before there was an HOA, before there were covenants, before most of these houses even existed." And I watched her eyes glaze over like I was telling her about my dream last night, like my family history was just noise between her and her violation quota. "That's lovely, truly," she said in that voice people use when something is the opposite of lovely. But the covenant was ratified in 1978 when the neighborhood incorporated, and all properties are bound by it, regardless of when they were built or who lived here previously. And she tapped her iPad screen, pulled up a PDF, zoomed in on a section she'd highlighted in digital yellow. "See here, section 4.3, subsection B. No resident may maintain vegetable gardens, herb gardens, or any food-producing plants in areas visible from the street or neighboring properties without written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." And I'm reading this section I've never seen before, this subsection that wasn't in the covenant I reviewed. And I asked her when this was added. "It was part of the 2019 amendments," she said, "approved by a vote of the board." I start calculating dates in my head, realizing I bought this house in 2020, right after my grandfather passed, and I definitely didn't get notified about any amendments. "I never received notification of these changes," I said. Margaret smiled, actually smiled. "All amendments are posted on the community website and emailed to residents of record." She said failure to review them doesn't constitute an exemption. I stood there watching this woman who probably spent her Saturday morning walking through the neighborhood with her iPad photographing people's yards like she was on a safari hunting for violations. And I realized something. This wasn't about gardens or covenants or architectural consistency. This was about control, about power, about Margaret Chen needing to be the person who decided what happened in this neighborhood. I'll need to review this, I told her, and I'd like to see the records showing when I was notified of the 2019 amendments. I watched that tightening happen again. The little compression around her mouth that meant someone was pushing back against her script. Mr. Harrison, I'm trying to give you the courtesy of correcting this before it becomes an official issue. She said, you have 14 days from today to remove all non-compliant plantings, submit an application for the rain barrel, which will likely be denied based on aesthetic concerns, and restore your front yard to covenant-compliant landscaping. She swiped to another screen, turned the iPad to show me a bulleted list she'd already prepared. My name at the top, my address, 17 line items, each with a description, each with a compliance deadline. And if I don't? I asked, because I needed to know how far she was willing to take this. Margaret's smile got wider, colder. Then the HOA will file a formal violation, she said. You'll be fined $500 per day per violation until compliance is achieved. And if you continue to refuse, we'll place a lien on your property and eventually force a sale to recover the debt. She said it like she was reading me a recipe, like the destruction of my family's home was just a series of administrative steps. I felt something shift in my chest, some combination of anger and disbelief that another human being could stand on my porch and threaten to take my grandfather's house over tomato plants. I think we're done here, I said. Margaret nodded, like I'd just agreed to her terms, like my dismissal was my surrender. I'll expect confirmation of compliance within 14 days. Have a lovely weekend, she said, and walked back down my driveway, iPad tucked under her arm. I stood there watching her go, watching her stop at the Johnson's house 3 doors down, watching her take photos of their front porch, and I thought about my grandfather, about how he'd planted this garden in 1963, about how my grandmother had maintained it after he died, about how my father had kept it going, and about how I'd promised them all I'd preserve it. And here was Margaret Chen, 5 years in the neighborhood, telling me it had to go. I spent the next week doing what Margaret should have done, actual research. I pulled the original covenant from 1978, the one filed with the county, and read through every word. And guess what wasn't there? Section 4.3, subsection B. I checked the 2019 amendments she'd mentioned, requested them from the county recorder's office, and found something interesting. The amendment had been voted on by the HOA Board, all 5 members, with Margaret as president. But the required notification to residents? The county had no record of it being sent, no proof it had been properly filed, no evidence that the 348 households in our neighborhood had been informed that the rules were changing. I called a real estate attorney, spent $200 for a consultation, and learned that covenant amendments require not just board approval, but also property owner notification. If that notification doesn't happen, the amendment isn't enforceable against owners who didn't receive it. So, I sent Margaret an email, polite, professional, explaining that I had no record of being notified about the 2019 amendments, requesting proof of when and how I was informed. I got a response within an hour, which should have been my first warning that this woman did nothing but monitor her HOA email account. Mr. Harrison, as previously stated, all amendments are posted on the community website. Your failure to check the website constitutes acceptance of all posted rules and regulations. You now have 9 days to achieve compliance. Regards, Margaret Chen, HOA President. I read it thinking, that's not how contract law works. That's not how any of this works. But Margaret Chen doesn't care about how things work. She cares about being right, about being in charge. Day 14 came and went. I didn't touch my garden, didn't submit any applications, didn't comply with a single item on Margaret's list. Day 15, I got the formal violation notice. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Official HOA letterhead. Dear Mr. Harrison, you are hereby notified that you are in violation of the Community Covenant Sections 4.3b, 6.7a, and 9.2c. You have accrued fines totaling $8,500 for non-compliance during the grace period. You are now being fined $1,500 per day until all violations are corrected. Failure to comply will result in a lien against your property. Signed by all 5 board members, with Margaret's signature first, largest, like she was signing a declaration of war. I called an emergency board meeting, which is my right. I showed up to Margaret's house because, of course, she holds the meetings in her living room, which looks like a furniture showroom. Everything white and gray, hard angles. I presented my research, showed them the county records, explained that I'd never been notified of the 2019 amendments, and argued that the fines were invalid. 4 board members looked uncomfortable and started asking Margaret questions about notification procedures. Maybe. But Margaret stood up, walked to her bookshelf, and pulled down a 3-ring binder that had to be 6 inches thick. "The covenant is clear," she said. "Ignorance of amendments is not an excuse. This board has a responsibility to maintain property values and community standards." She looked at the other board members one by one, and I watched them wilt. Remembered that Margaret controls the architectural committee. Margaret approves paint colors, fence repairs, and roof replacements. Margaret holds the power to make their lives difficult. One by one, they voted to uphold the fines. I wish I could say I handled it well, that I stayed calm, professional, but I looked at Margaret standing there with her binder, her power, her complete lack of empathy, and I said, "This isn't about covenants or property values. This is about you needing to control everyone around you because you have nothing else in your life." I watched her face go red, watched her point to the door, and heard her say, "This meeting is adjourned. You need to leave my property immediately." I left, but not before I saw it. That flash in her eyes, that look that said I just made this personal. That said, Margaret Chen was about to show me exactly how far she could push this. The fines kept coming, $1,500 a day, stacking up like accusations. I kept refusing to pay, kept refusing to comply. Margaret kept sending letters, kept documenting, kept building her case. And then one morning, I woke up to find her in my backyard. Actually, in my backyard, standing next to my tomato plants with her iPad taking photos. I opened the back door. "Margaret," I asked, "what the hell do you think you're doing?" "The covenant allows board members to inspect properties for violation verification," she said. "I'm within my rights." I told her to get off my property. "Or what? You'll call the police. Go ahead. I'm conducting official HOA business." She took 3 more photos before leaving, walking through my side gate like she owned the place. I stood there in my pajamas, thinking about how this woman had just trespassed on my property and somehow made it sound legal. That's when I decided it was time for the nuclear option. The thing I'd been saving, the document my grandfather gave me before he died, the one he kept in a safety deposit box, the one he told me to use only if someone tries to take the land. I drove to the county recorder's office, requested a certified copy, paid the fee, and held it in my hands. A deed dated March 15, 1890, written in fountain pen on paper, so old it was almost brown. A deed that granted my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Harrison, a parcel of land described as Lot 7, Block 3 of the former Martinez Ranch, including all water rights, mineral rights, and agricultural easements, in perpetuity. I read it over and over, thinking about what in perpetuity meant, thinking about what agricultural easements meant. This deed predates every single house in this neighborhood, predates the HOA by almost a century, and predates Margaret Chen's entire existence. I made an appointment with a property attorney, not the real estate guy I talked to before, but a specialist in historical land rights. I watched his eyes get wider as he read the deed, as he pulled up county maps, as he traced the property boundaries from 1890 to today. "Mr. Harrison, do you understand what you have here?" he asked. "I think so, but I need you to tell me for sure," I said. He smiled. Actually smiled. "This deed grants agricultural easements in perpetuity," he said, "which means no subsequent covenant, no HOA rule, no municipal ordinance can prohibit you from using this land for agricultural purposes. It's a superior right. It supersedes everything that came after." I felt something click into place. "So, the fines," I said. He nodded. "Invalid, unenforceable, and potentially fraudulent if they persist after you've notified the HOA of the easement." He charged me $500 to write a letter to the HOA, a letter that cited the 1890 deed, explained in legal terms why their fines were worthless, and demanded immediate cessation of all violation notices and removal of all penalties. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, and waited. 1 month ago, January 2026. 3 days later, my phone rang. 6:47 in the morning. "Margaret," I could hear something in her voice I'd never heard before. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I received a letter from your attorney that makes some very serious claims about a historical deed. I'm going to need you to provide proof of this document before we can consider any modification to your fines." I'm lying in bed, phone to my ear, thinking she's calling me before 7 a.m. She's not using her official HOA voice. She sounds like someone who just realized she might have made a catastrophic mistake. "The proof is attached to the letter, Margaret," I said. "Certified copy from the county recorder's office." I heard her breathing on the other end, heard papers shuffling. "This document is over 100 years old," she said. "There's no way it's still legally binding." I smiled. Actually smiled. "That's not what my attorney says. That's not what the county says. And that's definitely not what property law says. Agricultural easements in perpetuity mean exactly what they sound like. Forever." There was a long silence, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. "We'll see about that. The board is meeting tonight, and we're going to fight this." She hung up. I lay there thinking this woman would rather spend the HOA's money, the neighborhood's money, fighting a legal battle she couldn't win, than admit she was wrong. The fines didn't stop. They increased. Margaret sent a new letter claiming my refusal to comply now constituted willful defiance of community standards. The daily fine was now $12,500. I was looking at a total approaching $30,000. I sent another letter from my attorney. This one warned that continued fining in the face of a superior property right constituted harassment and could result in a countersuit. Margaret responded by calling an emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance for all residents. I showed up to the community center on a Thursday night, 200 people crammed into a room designed for maybe 80. Margaret stood at the front, a PowerPoint behind her titled, "Protecting Our Community Values." I sat in the back and watched her present, watched her show photos of my garden blown up on the projection screen like evidence of moral decay, watched her explain how one resident's refusal to follow the rules threatens all of our property values. She painted me as the villain, her stories the hero protecting the neighborhood from chaos. She never mentioned the deed, never mentioned the agricultural easement, and never mentioned that every fine she'd issued was legally worthless. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood up. "Margaret," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "tell them about the 1890 deed. Tell them about the agricultural easement that predates this HOA by a century. Tell them that every fine you've issued is unenforceable." I watched her face do that tightening thing again, but this time there was something else, something that looked almost like fear. "That's a matter under legal review," she said, "and not appropriate for public discussion." I laughed, actually laughed. "You've made my garden public discussion. You've sent letters to my neighbors asking them to report on my activities. You've turned this into a community issue. So, let's discuss it publicly." I pulled out my copy of the deed and held it up so everyone could see. "My family has farmed this land since 1890. No HOA rule written in 1978, 2019, or any other year can change that." I watched the room shift. People started murmuring. Other board members looked at Margaret with questions in their eyes. Margaret shut down the meeting, said we were out of order, and said the board would handle this matter privately. But the damage was done. People had questions now. People were wondering why their HOA president was spending their dues money fighting a battle over a garden. I left that meeting thinking maybe, I'd finally gotten through. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Downtown law firm, expensive letterhead, a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me for $50,000, accumulated fines, legal fees, and damages to community property values. Margaret had signed the authorization as president. I held the lawsuit in my hands, thinking about how she'd rather burn the neighborhood's entire legal budget than admit she was wrong. Then I saw it, buried on page 7 of the complaint, the thing that made my hands start shaking. The thing that explained everything. The lawsuit claimed my 1890 deed was fraudulent. The agricultural easement had been improperly recorded. My family had been illegally occupying the land for over a century. Attached to the complaint was a property survey Margaret had commissioned. A survey claiming my lot lines were different from what the county showed. A survey claiming my garden wasn't even on my property. It was on HOA common land. Now, February 2026. I'm staring at that fraudulent survey now, comparing it to the legitimate one from when I bought the house. It's an open declaration of war. She's willing to destroy my family's legacy to protect her own financial interests. She isn't just trying to destroy a garden, she's trying to erase a history. And that brings us back to today, standing at the fence line, looking at that fraudulent survey and the $50,000 fine in my hand. Margaret has no idea what's coming. We're in the endgame now. She's thrown everything she has at me, but I have truth, history, and a piece of paper from 1890 on my side. I look at her one last time with her fake smile and her boundless arrogance, and I realize she isn't going to win. This is my home. This is my grandfather's legacy, and I'm going to fight for it with everything I have. And when it's all over, Margaret Chen is going to learn that some roots are just too deep to pull.